Well, good morning, Michael. How's things?
Yeah, very good, Joe. How are you doing today?
Thank you very much. Yes, so in light of getting the show on the road, as they say, I'm going to sort of position what we're trying to achieve today, which really is two counts, two objectives, really primarily is sort of helping improve SMEs' performance with access to public spend contracts, bids and tenders. But I'm very passionate about the fact doing this work will actually support the business winning contracts outside of public procurement, as well as we see more and more companies move into sort of higher ESG credentials as part of their decision making process. And very quickly for the audience, today's collaboration is myself from ESG Pro. I'm joined by Michael from MACTA, and we are basically in collaboration, two highly skilled organizations that very much focus on supporting companies, in particular SMEs, access public spend contracts. And we offer fractional resources in the way that we approach our client relationships. So, Michael, I was going to sort of kick things off. I know you specialize in bids and tenders. I'm really sort of whether you could sort of give a high level as to what you're sort of currently seeing from trends around the public, around the Procurement Act and things like that.
Absolutely. So I think in terms of 2026, the UK Procurement Act of 2023 very much continues to influence the landscape. So what you're seeing is very much a focus from public sector procurement buyers on creating a transparent process and making opportunities more accessible. So to kind of give some numbers behind that, about 99.9% of the companies in the UK are SMEs, and about 99.2% of that are micro businesses. But at the moment, when it comes to public sector spend, only about 20% is spent with SMEs. If you look at that, for example, from local authorities, it's about 35%, but in central government, it's currently around 11%. So what the UK government has done is they basically focused on now creating a accountability, a 3 month, a 3 year focus on, the performance of how much SME spend how much spend is directly spent with SMEs, and those central government authorities, they need to publish that annually. So there's very much a focus on accountability. I think another thing which is symbolic but important is that previously they looked at, the most economic advantageous tender. Now they've basically changed that to the most advantageous tender. So really focusing not so much on cost, but the value that suppliers can bring to government buyers. And then finally, social value is very much changing, right? As an example, in the past, you could probably recycle a lot of the social value
Yeah.
answers. But now there's very much a focus on how does your social value response basically provide value to that specific contract. So as an example, one key mission from the UK government is kickstarting economic growth. So it's not enough to just say that, you're going to employ a bunch of people, but it really needs to be focused on who you're specifically going to, employ for that contract as an example, and how that'll benefit the contract. And then I guess from an ESG perspective, probably one of the most important SV themes is making Britain a clean energy superpowers.
Yeah.
I guess maybe from that perspective, Joe, what are the kind of regulatory trends that you're seeing at the moment?
Well, there's different regulatory trends, but bearing in mind for a lot of our SMEs, they're not subject to a lot of those regulatory, things like carbon emissions reporting. That's not, if you're not of a certain size, like 36 million, you don't have to do it. But obviously the PPN, which is the Public Procurement Notice, 006 is the Carbon Reduction Plan. And in theory, as part of your bid and tender, you need to have a baseline, you need a net zero statement, you need to be able to evidence year on year improvement. So in theory, whilst the SME is not regulated, it's almost driven to actually adhere to those things as part of one of the key components, alongside, as you've already said, things like social value. And I know it really staggered me with the amount of UK spend. I think it was like over 400 billion. And you were talking about like a percentages, and I know the KPIs is like 30%. You translate that back. I mean, even with my maths knowledge and everything, you're looking in excess of 100 and sort of £140 billion potential prize money in award of contract to SMEs. So it's significant. And the fact the government are now publishing how they're doing means that they've got transparency as well. So I think that's really, really significant. And also
Yeah.
picking up on your thoughts about social value, in an ideal world, you've got to be able to demonstrate that at a contract level in the location of where your goods and services are. And I know it's a big challenge for companies because many are pretty good at articulating what they're doing around where they are based. But if you're looking for UK wide, you've got to be able to demonstrate social value and impact in that location. So that's tough. It's tough for any size company. And of
So
course, SMEs really struggle as well. Yeah, so that's really interesting. I suppose on our journeys, we connect with lots of different businesses across different sectors. What's your, what do you sort of pick up normally as sort of the, not say the stereotype, but the sort of general weaknesses or challenges that SMEs are faced with what we're discussing today?
yeah, so that's a great question, Joe. I think very much similar to yourself. For example, often when we, work with clients, we see that it could be SME or founder based, and they've landed into the public sector through a local relationship, but they don't know how to scale that, right? So they perceive public sector sometimes as a bit complex, competitive, and compliance heavy. But actually, as we know, public sector is very good in being, transparent. And if you have a structure in place, it's quite a structured procurement process and transparent. So I think one of the key things often with founders is just trying to understand how do they scale and grow. So I think it's really important to understand who is your ideal client profile and not being too reactive and just responding to tenders, but understanding what are the opportunities in, 6 to 18 months and kind of taking a proactive approach, engaging with those buyers and building those relationships before the official process starts. And then also really being involved with the market engagement and influencing how those tenders are structured. So I think that's very important. Then from the bid delivery perspective, a lot of these companies, that I work with, they deliver an excellent service. They add a lot of value to the local communities. And the issue they sometimes have is how do they translate that into bid responses, right? So some of those issues can sometimes be, generic answers or weak evidence. So I always say, try to make it simple. Think about the points you're making, answer the question, provide an evidence or example, and then explain that. And then coming back to that, we were talking about that complexity. Try to simplify the process, build a library, really focus on that. And then, try to avoid certain issues like late late preparation. So for example, when it comes to ESG, I think it's important to be in a compliant ready
Yeah.
perspective already, rather than reacting to that when a bid comes. And then when it comes to social value, if a lot of companies do have good ESG strengths, but it's really understanding that you need to not just provide policies, but translate that into those responses and how that will deliver value specifically to the contract. So
Yeah, and I think building on them those challenges, I think from my point of view, and I'm speaking from previous experience myself, going for bids and tenders, and always the perception of myself, other stakeholders, was this theory about, it's going to cost a lot of money just to do the bid without necessarily knowing what the outcome was going to be. The perception again was I've got a low chance of winning. If I do win, it's going to potentially be high revenue. It's going to be low margin, so it's not profitable for the business. So there's those sort of overlying things. I'm going back a few years, and of course, then when you look internally, one thing's writing dare I say, a sales proposal or a presentation, responding to a bid and tender. Well, that's a completely different skill set, and from my experience engaging with SMEs, often, not say they're guilty, but they've been sort of doing it as an add-on to someone's role, so you're the office manager and all of a sudden now you're writing bids, content, copy, and understanding all of that and translating your company message into 30, 40, 50-page document without necessarily the opportunity to sit face to face, to stand in a room and present. So it's very much putting all of that evidence into that document. And of course, these Now, if we're looking at what's contained within the Procurement Act, we're talking about a multidiscipline response around, you talked about social value, locality impact, employee well-being, policies, modern slavery, bribery and corruption. What are you doing from a carbon emissions point of view? What about the supply chain? I mean, it is a big gig to do it, but of course we know the rewards are
Absolutely.
there. And then, of course, sometimes when I'm talking to my clients about, say, well, Joe, if we do this carbon reduction plan, what do we do with it? So I'm saying, well, you need to put it front of house. It needs to be on the website. What? We've got to put it onto the website. Yes. So just that simple thing,
Absolutely.
can sometimes drive a bit of debate because people are really nervous about it. But of course, in the eyes of the procurement and the frameworks, that is the ultimate transparency, making it available online. So rather than someone going through your annual report, and a lot of SMEs, dare I say it, can be quite limited in what they put into their company report, it's got to be front of house, it's got to be on the website. And of course, modern slavery statements and things, again, put it front of house. So I do find that is a shift in what people are, to say, happy to do, but they need to do it. So that's sometimes some quite contentious issues for SMEs.
Absolutely.
So look, if we're looking at that sort of bid and tenders process, without being, I suppose, too specific about exactly what you do, I know from discussions we've had that you've sort of got some variance in the way that you approach it, dependent on the organisation you're working for and dare I say the prize they're going for. Do you just want to sort of maybe just frame that for our audience today, Michael?
Yeah, I'd say thanks, Joe. So I'd say we're a public sector growth consultancy. So we really help our customers on the journey when it comes to the public sector procurement process. So really understanding first, are they ready for the public sector? What's their current situation? Where are they strong? Where do they have the evidence to demonstrate that they can deliver to contracts? So really understanding what are the ideal client profiles to focus on, and then helping create that capture planning process and pipeline to really understand what are the opportunities that are out there that are worth going for, and then for specific bids, really putting in a process, deciding is the yes bid or no bid, because as you were saying, Joe, there's a lot of resources involved in this, right?
Yeah,
So really
yeah.
understanding the compliance matrix, the scoring criteria, the commercials and financial viabilities there, as well as the social value criteria. And I think when you have that type of end-to-end process, really looking at it from a proactive perspective, you can really increase your win ratios, to over 50, 60%. And then I think that's
Wow.
important for a lot of businesses, right? Because you can show
Yeah,
real valuation,
yeah.
and you can show predictable new business revenue forecasts as well. And Joe, from your perspective as well, like how would you say ESG Pro can really help clients create that credible ESG evidence and be, for example, public sector ready?
Yeah, so I think I talk a lot about mirroring with my clients about who are you trying to connect and do business with. If it's not within the procurement frameworks, then it's, often a dedicated customer. Here, we've got a collection of customers. It could be multiple local authorities, multiple NHS placements. So really, it's just trying to find with them where they are. Clearly, they can evidence they might have had experience working there, delivering their product or solution. But really, it's that gap analysis. And I think the gap analysis looks at three distinct areas. One is the social value aspect. The other one is the sort of policy set that they have. Those multiple policies, which again, it's not mandatory to have it as an SME, but it's basically voluntary, but sort of highly recommended if you're going into business within the procurement framework. And of course, the other one is the carbon emissions. And I've seen sometimes companies think, well, let's just do the carbon reduction plan. And maybe 2 years ago, that was okay. But now there's added levels of pressure. You've talked about social value. We're sort of seeing 20-30% of award going across ESG, and E is just one of those three strings. And of course, when you look at
Mhm.
things like governance now, the data privacy, have they got cyber essentials? Have they got a data privacy statement? All of those things are really, really important. And we do often recommend connecting with the supply chain. So it doesn't matter how big or small that supply chain is. And one of the key things that we try and energize is that we can connect with the supply chain, and by using our sort of ESG risk assessments, we can turn that into quantified social value and impact. So if you're a business of 50 people and you're influencing your smaller businesses, then we can turn that into social value. And of course, we can then demonstrate locality, but we're also ensuring that we've got no risks with our supply chain. So those are sort of a few examples. I
No,
know
that
sometimes,
makes a lot of sense.
yeah. And have you got any thinking about sort of examples, stories where you've sort of helped companies? Maybe if you can think of a couple, and I'll do the same.
Yeah, so perhaps one example is, so maybe I'll give an example of a bigger company and then a smaller one at different journeys. So I was helping one of the UK's largest professional services companies that basically had a challenge in that one of their core markets was the police forces, and they had a very dominant hold of that market, but they started to see a little bit of competitive forces there, and kind of churn on the client base. So one thing we did was to kind of turn that story over. It was not just about bid writing, but really understanding what the organization's strategic positioning is, and kind of help with that solution design build out. So one of the things we did was we storyboarded and we engaged with the procurement people before the actual, the official process, and we understood what are their kind of buying motivators or buying signals. And one thing which became very clear was that a lot of the professional services was delivered on site, which impacted service delivery and increased higher costs. So one of the things that we did in the solution design was understood how we could digitally transform that and deliver those services through video. So I think one of the key things there was really understanding that you redefine the proposition and what's a competitor differentiation. And then once a tender came out, having that end-to-end process to really ensure that we align to the scoring criteria, but that we're also, we've also influenced those actual tender questions. And maybe, Joe, from like the perspective of a smaller company, right? We were working with an architectural design and planning consultancy, and they very much were interested in working with housing associations
Yeah,
just because of the repeat business opportunity there. And as we provided the opportunity identifications and tender writing for those bids, and we were actually successful in getting them on a housing association framework, which was
yeah,
the first public sector customer they had. One of the issues was they found a compliance risk in that one of the issues was in terms of compliance risk, you required ISO 9001 for quality and then ISO 14001 for the environment. Originally, they were planning to do it themselves, but because of the tight procurement window between award date and contract go live, they basically utilized us to help with getting those ISO certifications. So it was that was a good success story. But when I think about it, it was also somewhat reactive when it came to the compliance element of ESG. So maybe from your perspective as well, if you have some good examples of how you help clients with ESG readiness from a proactive perspective rather than reactive, that would be interesting to hear.
yeah. And your point about housing association, I can built real life for me. Going back 2021 in a previous sort of business, I was a company director. We had a very happy housing association. We were providing technology, software and services. They had to go through a formal RFP, although they didn't want to do it, but they had to do that. There was a 20% weighting on ESG, and we were just really, really struggling and coming up with lots of fluffy stuff to try and get as many points as we could. But bottom line was, it was just under £1 million contract, a client of 12 years. And we lost them. And they were very disappointed, the key stakeholders we were aligning to, but we just fell short in a high score area. And actually, interesting enough, that then sort of led me to engage with actually ESG Pro to help us then protect ourselves with other relationships, one of which I know I felt we went through an uncontested renewal because we'd presented ourselves as an SME with an ESG rating. So that massively helped. And then we turned it into a competitive advantage by offering our clients, would you like help with your ESG reporting? So that was myself quite a significant contract. And of course, we've not talked about the other sort of element within the whole procurement, which is the sort of NHS. And I'm seeing a lot of work and focus at the moment with the new Evergreen Sustainability Matrix. And there's 4 levels. And we had a client just sort of autumn of last year. I'm talking a very, very small business. They were fantastic job. They were making, people going through chemotherapy, hair falling out. And this particular company made wigs for those people during that treatment. And they were basically told, well, like, if you want access to the next round of engagement, you've got to have the carbon reduction plan and you've got to meet the NHS mandatory level 1. And they'd never really heard of Evergreen. So we stepped in and, help them do that in a quite short window of time. And that meant that they would then continue their relationship with the NHS, which quite frankly, had they not done that, they wouldn't be in business now. So I think, and this was a micro business, sub 10 employees. So it just shows how this is focusing, but it's a risk, but it can be turned into an opportunity as well. I know we've sort of conscious we were trying to keep this as sort of sub 25 minutes. Clearly, we'd like from today that the audience wants to check in and have some time with us, but thinking about sort of call to action we could do to help people beyond today, Michael, have you got any sort of thoughts and ideas?
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. So I think we could probably help anyone who might be interested in having a complimentary review of their bid responses, do a gap analysis there, and then just provide some immediate actionable insights. Another thing is, in terms of go to market, if certain companies are trying to understand if they're ready to go for the public sector, we could always help them with the ESG and bid management readiness review and provide like an hour free consultation, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah, yeah, and I think we've spoken openly about if we've got 45 minutes, an hour with the audience, we're quite happy to sort of have a call together with the customer just to give our sort of, I think we've got a really all round 360
Yep.
approach to this, and I think that's something I'd be very happy to do if people want to check in and ask for that. That'd be super. And again, the gap analysis depending on their size, where they want to sort of do business, we could sort of carry out. We've got like a readiness assessment that we carry out. We've got a sort of 4-stage process with our SMEs, so we don't sort of try and build Rome overnight. We think about the steps that we need to
Absolutely.
go through, and really importantly that we don't bring the company to a standstill during the process. They're still running a business, and we try and do it in bite-sized chunks so they can still keep their
Mhm.
focus on frontline core services delivery whilst we improve this area. And I know I've always had this sort of feeling, don't let perfection get in the way of progress, because it's about continual improvement, right? So no one is a master of this. It's
Absolutely.
about just doing better next year than you've done this year. So any just before we sort of wrap up, would there be 1 or 2 takeaways or something that you would sort of say that as recommendations for our audience?
Yeah, I think especially when you're working with public sector, don't try to, like you said, roam overnight. Don't be too aspirational necessarily. Be realistic and, provide quantifiable solutions that are realistic, especially if you're a micro business or a small company, because the public sector buyers they understand that as well. And they just like to see that it's something which is basically aligned to smart objectives. So that I think would be one of the key takeaways. What
Yeah.
about you, Joe?
My mindset would be try and be proactive versus reactive, be on the front foot,
Hmm.
because as you know, when a bid and tender comes in, it's asking for evidence. You can't manufacture evidence because you've got nothing historic. So you need to build the historic evidence ready for the bid and tender, not wait and then try and craft something. I made that mistake myself. And then the other thing, I think you mentioned it earlier, but sometimes people think about this as red tape and compliance and regulations, but just think about it as a growth lever for the business to make you more sustainable going forward. And it's a tough gig for SMEs, but if you do it better than the other ones, then maybe you're going to get a bigger piece of the cake. And we know that local authorities, government, NHS, they don't tend to award 100% of the business to one organisation. So there's lots of opportunity there, I think, for wallet share. So I think we've sort of got near enough to the end, Michael. Sorry, is there something else just as we finish?
Yeah, just to finish, and I think touching on that, like one very good point you made is when it comes to working with these public sector buyers, is that the revenue is also predictable. So you know the contract life cycle value, and you know how much you're going to spend annually. So that's always a huge benefit as well.
Yeah, yeah, and the other, I know credit getting paid is a big challenge for SMEs, and of course, whilst it
Absolutely.
may not be overnight payment, you know it's guaranteed payment, right? So at least there's you got the assurance of that as well. So brilliant. Well, look, thanks to you today, Michael, for joining me. Thanks for those that are listening, whether you're in the office, at home, out on a walk with a dog, or running, or something like that. We hope you've enjoyed our sort of introduction, and very much just connect with Michael or myself, and we'd be delighted to provide that sort of 45 minutes, 1 hour workshop at no cost. And love to meet you again very, very soon. Thank you very much, everybody.
Oh, thanks, Joe. Thanks, guys.